If you could totally rethink work, what would it look like? Well, you would start by paying attention to Wes Adams, today's guest on the DesuckifyWork Podcast. Wes has quite a few thoughts on this subject. As founder and CEO of SV Consulting Group, his mission is to transform organizations into hubs of human thriving. Bold? Absolutely. And he's got the chops to back it up. With more than 2 decades of experience as a successful entrepreneur and strategic partner for Fortune 500s, startups, and NGOs. His insights? Rethink the old command and control model. It's done. Leaders need to be open to new ideas from younger workers and give up some power and control. Rethink hybrid. We need to leverage the best parts of remote and in-office to benefit everyone and give teams autonomy to determine what's best for them. You know, the exact opposite of what we're doing right now. We also need to rethink what work means to each of us by creating more meaning at work. Wes is working with previous podcast guest Tamara Miles on a book that tells us how to do it. Look for Meaning at Work: How Exceptional Leaders Combine Community, Contribution, and Challenge to Unleash Potential and Inspire Greatness early next year. No need to wait for Wes's brilliant POV on work. Here he is right now. Okay, Wes Adams, welcome to the DesuckifyWork Podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. I think we'll get into some good stuff. And I know you know one of our previous guests, which we can talk about, Tamara Miles, and you guys have worked together. But before we dive into that connection, can you just give us a little bit about who you are, what you do for work, and how you came to be doing it?
Absolutely. I have an agency called SV Consulting Group, and we do primarily leadership development and organizational design work. Like one of your previous guests, Tamara, I have a background in positive psychology. I went to the MAP program at Penn, and that's the lens through which I do a lot of my work. How do we help people grow, develop, and reach their full potential?
Nice. Well, I think we'll get into all of that. You know, before we do, though, I like to ask people a little bit about their own work journey. So, first question: what role does work play in your life?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say it plays a pretty primary role. I focus a lot on, and we'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, in a minute about where meaning at work comes from. But for me, the challenge piece of work, how am I growing, developing? How am I stretching my own capabilities? How am I achieving more, contributing more, giving more back? A lot of that comes through the work that I do every day. So I'd say it's pretty significant.
Was there a point in your life where you didn't have all that? You know, maybe you had a suckier work experience and it triggered something, or has this always been there for you on some level?
There was. My first job out of school was at an insurance company in New York, and I worked in the legal department in contract compliance. And essentially, this was before we had document readers, before you could drop something in Word and track changes and all of that. So I was basically reading contracts from all of the offices around the country, about 3,000 of them a year, and checking them to make sure that they weren't different than the standard contract.
Wow.
So I was essentially looking at the same contract over and over all day long, just looking for things that were mistakes or were different or were changes. And it was one of the most mind-numbingly boring jobs ever. And it's the only time I've ever walked in at 9, walked out at 5, and just not thought about work at all. And ever since then, I think I've tried to get as far away from that kind of experience as possible.
Yeah, I can't blame you personally. It wouldn't work for me. I'm sure there are people out there for whom that might be very peaceful to just be staring at the same thing all day, but hard for me to wrap my head around it. And it sounds like it was for you.
It didn't strain or stretch me in any way.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, talking about the state of work, maybe on a broader level, you obviously get to interact with a lot of people in your work, with leaders, with teams. What's your take on the state of work in general right now? If there was a suck meter from not too bad to holy crap, like where is it?
I actually think we're in a really interesting moment. I believe Tamara talked a little bit about this when she
Hmm.
was on, but we're in a real paradigm shift where we're reevaluating both what work should look like in our lives, what role should it play, how much of ourselves should we give to work versus other areas, investing in other areas of our life, and
Hmm.
also the process of work, the design of how we operate, which largely evolved from the factory floor system and has been iterated on a number of times since then. But the foundational elements of the way that most companies work today make some assumptions that are about command and control. They're structured in a way that has a hierarchy that's about keeping people in their lanes, making sure they're doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. And
Hmm.
that model, I think it's arguable whether or not that model ever was the best model, but it's clear that in a world of increasing change and uncertainty, that model does not deliver results for any of us, for
Hmm.
organizations, for leaders, for employees. So it's exciting to see that model change, and I think
Hmm.
that that change also aligns with what I'd like to see, which is making the model of work more human and more geared towards bringing out the best of our capabilities and helping each of us reach our full potential as we're contributing to
Hmm.
the goals and missions of our organizations.
Hmm. As I hear that, I think, okay, who's who's doing that really well, making that step from the command and control, and maybe not even a company if you don't want to get that specific, but if you're noticing it in certain industries, and then is there any groups that seem to be struggling with it more, and how do we help them?
That is a great question. I'm thinking about whether I can think of a company that's made a good transition. I think
Hmm.
actually Microsoft is probably a good example of this,
Cool.
and everything that happened after Satya Nadella came in. And there's, of course, a lot of, uh, writing about that, but just transitioning the company to more of a place that welcomed different ideas, where people were more collaborative rather than siloed and competing for
Hmm.
roles within the organization and power within the organization. So, at any organization of that size, it's very difficult to make that kind of cultural transformation.
Yeah.
And while it's by no means perfect, my understanding from what I've read and experienced of Microsoft as a client is that they've done a pretty good job of moving in the right direction. We all
Mm.
always have more work to do,
Of
but
course.
yeah, I think that's a good example. It's very difficult to make that change, though. I
Hmm.
can probably point to a couple of organizations that started out that way and are succeeding, but
Hmm.
making the shift is hard. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing in the media around work today. It's what
Hmm.
underlies the conversation about workplace flexibility. It's what underlies the
Hmm.
conversation around the generational differences that there are and the struggle working across them.
Hmm.
I would say just that shift is uncomfortable. And
Yeah. It's interesting to observe some of it. Sometimes it's a little painful to observe. You see some of those media hits, and you're like, "Ooh, at the very least, maybe that executive shouldn't have said that." Maybe they had to do what they had to do, but sometimes the communication around it is a struggle. But I
mm,
imagine there's some just natural human attachment to what we know, and it can be hard. So it's actually quite impressive to hear that a company like Microsoft is making strides, because that's one of the things I imagine is one of the most difficult things in this sort of desuckify work process is these giant organizations with deeply embedded cultural
mm,
glue. Like, to move that at all can be really hard. So it's impressive to see some folks at least making the steps, and hopefully others will see that
mhm.
and be at least, emboldened by it a little bit, that like, oh, okay, maybe we can do this. And then it comes to you mentioned the generational thing. And I wonder a
Mhm.
little bit if that's going to be the thing that also nudges people, because you've got a lot of younger workers who have very different expectations around what work should be, and a lot of it's aligned to what you're talking about. There is an expectation of some kind of purpose or meaning at work. There's an expectation of some amount of flexibility at work. Um, you had actually shared something recently, I think, about the generations, and I was intrigued by it, because it was like, there's the kids these days, they don't know blah blah
Mhm.
blah, and like, I don't know, I remember getting that when I was coming up too. I'm a Gen X, and it was like Gen X are slackers and all the thing and da da da. So some of that you take with a
We're the
grain of
work
salt.
hard, play hard generation.
Exactly. Now we are, right, but when we were like young, I don't know, I think we were the like, who cares generation, right? A little bit like that, all those movies, Singles and stuff. um but the kids these days, they have a lot of interesting things to offer, and you kind of highlighted some of their strengths that we should pay attention to. Do you have kind of access to that right now as I bring that back up for you?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting conversation, and there's a lot to be learned on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, every generation that enters the workforce comes in with new ideas and thinks they can solve the problems that the older people couldn't figure out. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a natural process of being new at anything and learning. And I
Yeah,
was that way as well, and rolled my eyes at some of the older folks
of
and the
course.
organizations that I work in. And I ended up learning a lot from them. And I
Mm-hmm.
think there is a real opportunity for the folks coming in, the Gen Z folks coming into the workforce, to do that, because the people that have been around and have experience have seen a lot of things that they haven't seen,
Mm-hmm.
and have a lot of valuable knowledge and expertise to share with them.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, the world is changing very quickly. And the
Mm-hmm.
way that Gen Z folks grew up is completely different than even the way that millennials grew
Yeah.
up. There's a recent book that's out from Jonathan Haidt, who was one of my professors, called
Mm.
The Anxious Generation. And it's about the impact that social media has had on Gen Z folks, people who were
Yeah.
born 1997 or after. And the way that they grew up and their interaction with social media, and the way that that impacted, you know, brain development and approaches to conversation and interaction, I think, creates some additional challenges there. Also, remember, at pivotal moments, they went through COVID, right? So when
Mm-hmm.
they're at these key moments when people are developing social skills and learning how to interact with each other in college or in their first
Mm-hmm.
jobs, they're stuck at home
Yeah.
and having to figure that out. And that's not an easy thing to recover from, I think, for any of us. I think we're all
Yeah.
still impacted by that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's much more access to information and much less tolerance for bullshit, frankly.
Yeah.
The expectation of people coming in to the workforce now is that they're going to be brought into the loop, that they're going to be told why they need to do the things that they're being
Mm-hmm.
asked to do,
Yeah.
and that they're going to be respected as members of the organizational community, and not just reading contracts and
Mm-hmm.
um, you know, doing what I did, which
Mm-hmm.
quite frankly wasn't a very good use of my time. I didn't
Right.
learn much in the year that I worked at that
Mm-hmm.
organization. And I've talked to a fair number of folks in the process of writing this book that Tamara and I have been working on. And the Gen Z folks, they want to learn, they want to be
Yeah.
engaged, they want opportunities to grow and to contribute to things that are meaningful to them. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think sometimes that comes off as entitled to people who are older, who
Yeah.
felt like they had to earn their way. It can feel like,
Yeah.
you know, kids are jumping the line and they're not being respectful of
Mm-hmm.
authority or of seniority or whatever. And they're also saying, you know what, I don't want to. Great, you worked 100 hours a week and did whatever you were told when you were coming up. I'm sorry you had to do that. I'm not doing that because you
Mm,
had to do that. I
yeah.
want to be treated like a human, and I want to actually learn and grow and do something that's meaningful to me. So I think there are pretty reasonable things coming out of that conversation that maybe
Yeah.
some of us older folks should pay attention to and learn from as
Yeah.
well.
How dare they want to be treated like a human? I mean, where do they get these ideas? Well, it's funny, as you started saying that, I thought, well, and then you mentioned the idea that like there's still room to learn from us older folks. Like, I just think it's the dynamic can change, but there can still be some of that information and wisdom sharing. It's just much more of a mentor mentality instead of a, like you said, kind of command and control. You have to go through the hazing that I went through of having to work my butt off doing nonsense for 5 years until I get a real thing like that. There's no need for that to
Hmm.
accomplish the goal of those who've come before you have some interesting information and wisdom to share. And if we create more of a culture built around mentorship,
Hmm.
that's less like you do this and more like, have you thought about doing this? Have you
Right.
considered this? Or I experienced something similar to you, and here's what I did. It might be helpful. Just shifting that mindset can still can accomplish some of what I think people think might be missing, but do it in a way that doesn't uh, reduce people to less than human.
Mm.
Have you
Can I?
experienced anybody playing around more with mentorship as a bigger part of their culture?
Well, before I answer that,
Yeah.
that actually made me think of a conversation I had with someone last week. We were
Mm,
talking about change within an organization, and she said that all change comes with loss.
mm,
And I think that's a really powerful thing to remember because it's not just a mindset shift that we're asking more senior leaders to make. It's
yeah.
also giving up some things that they worked very hard to get. They
Mm,
worked really hard coming up through that old system
hmm.
to build up experience, build seniority, build up power to be in the position of being
Yeah.
the person who's directing things and telling people what to do
Yeah.
because they were, subjected to that or experienced that, right? And so by making this shift in mindset, we're also saying to people, you have to give up some of that. You actually have to give some of that power back to the people who are just entering the workforce. You have
Mm,
to be open to their ideas. You
yeah.
have to care about what they think about what's happening in their lives,
Hmm.
which in many cases wasn't done for them. Whether
Yeah.
or not they wanted it at that age,
Yeah.
you know, which they probably did.
Mm,
I know that I did.
yeah.
um, it's a change in the system for someone who's worked really hard and invested for a really long time in that
Mm,
system. And so
yeah.
we're asking people to give that up. And whether or not it's the right thing to do, I think it's important to acknowledge that we are asking people to give up something that they worked for to
That's
do
fair.
that. And
Hmm.
that gets in the way.
Yeah.
That's something that can get in the way.
I can see that. I think um, our identities get tied up in how we work and how we show up, and the idea that we have sort of earned a certain place and a certain ability to be in a position of power and be able to direct, like that becomes part of who we are. Um,
Hmm.
and yeah, to give that up, um, yeah, I can see how it could feel a little bit like a loss. And the flip of that to me goes, how do we help folks see what's to be gained
Hmm.
from giving something up? What is on the other side of that? Your ability to be more of a mentor and a coach to people. What can you gain from that that can fill up some of what's been lost in that
Hmm.
space? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I think there's an enormous amount to gain
Mm-hmm.
if you are open to continuing to learn and open to doing the work of
Yeah.
making that shift. It can become much more meaningful to be engaged with a community of people who share your values and are working towards the same goals rather than standing above them and trying to direct them while not
Mm-hmm.
being a part of that group. It brings much more effective ideas to the table. I mean, from a
Hmm.
business perspective, I mean, the research is very clear, hands down. It's a better way to lead.
Yeah.
It's more productive. There's even some recent research that shows um, a predictive effect between employee well-being and stock price over
Hmm.
time.
Wow.
So it's actually, even if you're just looking at the fiduciary
Yeah.
responsibility of a leader,
Hmm.
there's actually hard evidence that you're not doing your job if you're
Mm.
steamrolling your people like that.
That's really cool.
Um, yeah, it's just about whether or not you're willing to be a learner at a high level and continue to do the work. And it's uncomfortable work,
Yeah.
as any
Yeah.
change and growth is.
It definitely can be. I think, I think you have to figure out how you can embrace it and see how that growth can, you talked about things like values, and it's like, okay, what do I value and how can this process maybe contribute or support me in my values? Maybe I'm used to supporting those values in a very different way. And
Mhm.
then this shift allows me to connect to them differently. But yeah, it is hard. I think and I wonder if that's just a little bit of what's in the air right now. We talk about this moment in work, and I think there are, as you said, sort of reasons to be optimistic that we're making a pretty big shift towards something exciting. But there's a turmoil in all of
Mhm.
this. A lot of people are probably going through loss. A lot of the younger folks are in this place of I don't quite know how to enter this weird workplace. Um,
Mhm.
so that's being felt. That discomfort is being felt at a societal level. Um, I imagine we kind of just have to be patient and go through it. But are there any thoughts you have about how we can help people handle the discomfort that's coming with this sort of broad change that's happening?
I think normalizing it is a big part of that. Often we don't engage in those uncomfortable things because we don't want to feel vulnerable in front of other people, or we don't want to
Mm,
show weakness. And
yeah,
especially when you have moved into the C suite, you feel like often you need to have all of the answers,
yeah.
and you're going to look stupid, or you're going to look like you don't know what you're doing if you're
Hmm.
asking questions rather than giving answers, when in fact that's actually the best way to build trust, and the best way
Hmm.
to build a thriving organization is to be clear when you don't know and to ask other people what their ideas are, especially again in this changing environment that we're in.
Hmm.
We need all of those different voices and perspectives coming to the table, because there's no way one person can have all the answers to all
Yeah,
of these things that are happening in the world.
yeah.
um, yeah, so I think normalizing that. I think also realigning some of the incentives in a company.
Mm,
I'm a big fan of a book called Mixed Signals by a researcher named Yuri Nizi,
hmm.
which is basically about incentive design and how often incentives drive behaviors that are counter to what we think
Hmm.
they
Yeah.
should be
Hmm.
driving. And the example that stuck with me from that book, which I really like, is school administrators were frustrated with parents coming late to pick up their kids,
Hmm.
because basically, teachers had to stay late. They're waiting
Right.
around, and it's really annoying. And so what they did was basically institute like a $5 fine or something every time you were late to pick up your kids. And
Yeah.
what happened actually is parents realized they could get an extra half hour of babysitting for $5, and they're like, that's a great deal. And so there was more lateness
Oh my
than
gosh.
before. And even after they removed that incentive, the change had been made, the
Mm,
values had been um, transmitted, and they kept coming late to pick up their
wow.
kids. And so I think, the way that we compensate people, the way that
Hmm.
we bonus people, the way that we promote people for a very long time, especially in the US,
Hmm.
being promoted, advancing in your career has required you to manage more people,
Hmm.
right? That's sort of the path to get there.
Yeah.
And my experience is that a lot of the people who move up actually don't want to be people managers.
Mm-hmm.
They're very happy as individual contributors. They're good at what they do as individual contributors, but the only way that we give them to make more money, to take on new challenge, is to manage a group of people.
Yeah.
And some people just don't want to do that. And I think that's totally fine. We need to
I
create a
agree.
path in organizations for individual contributors to continue to grow without having to manage people
Mm-hmm.
if they don't want to. And when we do move people into management positions or leadership positions, it just needs to be clear that just because you were good at making widgets doesn't mean that you are going to be any good at all at managing people who are making widgets, right?
Yeah.
People leadership, people management is its own set of skills.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of companies, we just throw people into those positions and we don't give them any training. We don't
Mm-hmm.
give them any support.
Yep.
And, I wouldn't ask you to be my accountant and do my books with no training. I'm trusting you with a very valuable part of my business, right?
Yeah.
Why would I give you a management role without making sure that you were prepared to be a people manager?
Mm.
So I think disentangling moving up in an organization or making more money from leading people would be
Yeah.
really helpful in getting some of the folks who probably are now in senior roles who actually don't want to have anything to do with managing people
Mm-hmm.
out of those roles.
Yeah. God, that's a really big one. It shows up big time in the world I come from, which is advertising. I mean, you have people who
Mm-hmm.
are really strong at their craft of design or writing or art direction, and really the only way to to grow beyond a certain point is to become a creative director or further up, where you have to lead people. And
Mm-hmm.
I have been kind of like trying to make this call, like, hey, like, there's a lot of value in somebody who's just really, really, really good at something, and there's a lot of value not just in their work themselves, but sort of they're leading by example. They can be somebody that people can go to for advice around craft, but they don't have to be responsible for this team of 10 or 12 people that they either don't want to do or don't have the skills to do. And it's amazing to me that that's not baked in and that people don't see that value. And then I also think when you get to the point of what is the path for leadership, is there some value in assessing people's, one, do they want it? But two, what are their skill sets? Where, do they show potential in the areas that people leadership needs? Because some people, they don't have it. And even if they want it, it's going to be a bigger struggle for it. So have you seen any organizations or anyone you work with where that's part of the process of developing kind of emerging leaders, is to see what kind of skills they have to work with and how that can be applied in a people leadership versus the making widgets world?
I think there's some nuance there that's important.
Yeah.
I do know of a number of companies that use those types of assessments to evaluate, even in the hiring process, to
Mm.
evaluate
Yeah.
people for whether they should join the company or whether they should move into a certain role.
Mm-hmm.
I generally am not in favor of assessments driving someone's qualification for a certain
Yeah.
role. I think
Mm-hmm.
if you are genuinely interested in being a people manager and you want to learn,
Mm-hmm.
that you should have the opportunity to do that. Because I
Yeah.
think actually we need a diversity of learning styles. We need people who come from
That's a great point.
different perspectives. And just because, let's say, you're an engineer, a software engineer, and the stereotypical software engineer, sits at home, codes, doesn't have
Mm-hmm.
great people skills or whatever. I
Yeah.
think actually, if there's someone in that role who genuinely wants to be a manager of people and puts the work in to do that, that person is going to bring a unique and really valuable
Mm.
perspective to leadership, especially of that, group of people of which they were a part.
Yeah.
And so on that front, I'm not really in favor of using assessments to determine whether or not someone should be a leader. I
Yeah.
am in favor of using assessments and other tools like 360s or
Hmm.
any of these things that are out there to determine what someone's strengths are, what someone's areas of improvement are,
Hmm.
as we're looking at the capabilities that someone needs to be a successful leader. Where are they strong?
Mm.
What can they lean into to do
Yeah.
better? Where might they need to focus on filling in gaps with a partner or someone
Mm.
else on the team, right?
Mm.
That self-awareness piece is where all great leadership starts. You can't be a great leader if you're not aware of your own
Mm.
thoughts, of your own abilities, capabilities, and limitations.
Yeah, I really like that perspective. It's yeah, the idea that this is how I'm hearing it. The idea that okay, I know my strengths. How can I apply those in a position of people leadership? How can they benefit me there? And then yeah, if I have some gaps, one, just having them out, one, the self-awareness and the sort of team-wide awareness to know like, okay, here's where I'm going to need support. And if you create more of the culture like we were talking about before, where it is more supportive, um, you can feel more comfortable maybe talking to your new boss as you get promoted up into people leadership to say, I'm seeing my strengths and I'm excited to lean into those to lead. I may need some support here,
Hmm.
whether that's from you, from some partnership, or even from the team itself. How do we develop a way of me stepping into this, knowing all of this? And then how can I maybe, make some improvements where there are some gaps? I mean, that feels like what makes sense to me. Do you see that happening in some of the groups that you work with?
Yeah, there are absolutely companies that I think are doing this well and are not only assessing those things, but making sure to provide the appropriate level of support, training, ongoing peer support, I think is really important. Having a
Mm-hmm.
trusted group of people who
Yeah.
are in similar positions. One of the other challenges of moving up in an organization is it can become lonelier and lonelier as there are
Mm-hmm.
fewer people at your level. The
Yeah.
biggest example of this being CEOs of companies who essentially
Mm-hmm.
have no one to talk to about
Yeah.
what they're going through, which
Yep.
is why some of the organizations like YPO and Entrepreneurs Organization and things like that
Mm-hmm.
are, I think, so successful because they create groups of people, groups of peers that can lean on each other
Mm-hmm.
and support each other through the challenges and opportunities that come at that level. And I think there's a huge opportunity to do that at all levels within a
Mm-hmm.
company.
Yeah, I think there's something in vulnerability, being okay and comfortable and safe to sort of know and state where you need support, and then to have an environment that allows you to fill that, or have communities that allow you to be supported by that. Um, I think about leadership, and you mentioned this earlier, this flexible work environment that a lot of younger folks are wanting, and people Gen X and even older, I think, appreciate. And companies, I think, have struggled with this a bit. Some just purely with how they communicated some of the return to office mandates, some with maybe how they're delivering upon that. And you have done some really interesting work exploring that around how you can rethink what a hybrid workplace looks like. And I think you use the phrase something like the best of both worlds. And I think to my own experience and what I've seen, and it's been quite the opposite for many. It's actually been the worst of both things
Mm.
somehow combined. So I'm really excited to know, how do you get the best of both worlds in a hybrid, flexible environment?
I don't think there's a single answer that works
Yeah.
for everyone. I think it depends largely on your organization, the values that you have, the business that you're in, the type of work that you do.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I think it's fairly clear that there are activities that benefit from being in person, and there are
Mm-hmm.
activities that benefit from being remote or having quiet time to yourself or not being
Mm-hmm.
distracted. Um, the ones that are important to do in person are the relationship building
Mm-hmm.
piece of it, the creative collaboration, the brainstorming,
Mm-hmm.
and learning also happens more effectively in person. And finally, I think the inspirational, aspirational piece of things,
Mm.
how you're coming together around a shared vision of where you want this organization to go.
Mm-hmm.
Those things just work better in person. And whether you are a 5 day a week in the office company or you're fully remote, building in time for people to meet up and to focus on those activities specifically and only when you're together is
Mm-hmm.
incredibly valuable
Yeah.
to moving whatever your agenda is forward. On
Mm-hmm.
the other side, getting your work done, executing on those things, creating decks, um, all of the things that basically involve doing the work
Mm-hmm.
rather than necessarily talking about the work or strategizing about
Mm-hmm.
the work. But the execution piece of it, a lot of that can happen remotely or in some kind of hybrid format that's
Mm-hmm.
best directed at the team level rather than the organization
Yeah.
level. Going back to your advertising example, the creative team may want to get together a little bit more often as they're executing on a brief to
Mm-hmm.
course correct, whereas the people in the accounting department probably don't need to come into the office, right? It's not a
Yeah.
one size fits all, and giving
Mm-hmm.
folks the autonomy to
Mm-hmm.
do that with some guardrails or with some boundaries,
Yeah.
I think is one way to be really effective
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
But I think the mistake that I see most companies making is this default to mandates. We're going to do
Mm-hmm.
3 days a week in the office, or we're going to do
Yeah.
4 days a week in the office, basically because it's too, what I read from that is it's too complicated to
Mm-hmm.
figure out this nuanced system. And we just
Mm-hmm.
need you to be here.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then you have people coming in and just being on Zoom calls all day or Teams
Yep.
calls all day from the office, and that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't benefit everyone. No
No.
one needs to do that. And
Yeah.
so what it requires, in my view, is much more intentional work design than we've
Mm-hmm.
had before.
Yeah.
And really, you need in-house the capabilities that were previously reserved for event planners or experiential marketers
Mm-hmm.
or producers of live events, that sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. If you're asking people to come into the office, they need to have a good reason to come into the office, and
Mm-hmm.
you have to curate that experience to focus on those things, not
Yeah.
just tell them to be in and turn them loose without any support. And that's another change, and
Mm.
that's really difficult. It's not something that's ever been required in an
Yeah.
organization before, and it's
Mm-hmm.
a new set of capabilities that I think some people are actually really leaning into.
Yeah.
One of the companies that I've studied a bit is Reddit, and they moved to a
Mm-hmm.
fully remote during the pandemic, and they still maintain 10 or 15 offices around the world, but they don't require anyone to come in, and they've redesigned those offices, taken
Mm-hmm.
out some of the smaller offices, created event spaces basically, or
Mm-hmm.
auditorium type spaces, which are
Yeah.
more geared around when everybody does come together, we're going to focus on these big inspirational presentations of where the
Mm-hmm.
organization is going, or we're going to be learning together, or doing those things that benefit from being in person. And
Mm.
then they're actually channeling resources and personnel into supporting people in doing things to connect with other, they call their employees snooze. So other snooze in the area that you happen to be in.
Oh, that's
So,
cool.
when you do come into the office, they have essentially an event planning team that will help you plan your team's time in the office so that it's most effective. So
Mm.
they've built that capability in house. And then they also essentially give grants to people to, whether that's go to a ball game together, or,
Mm-hmm.
whitewater rafting, or whatever the thing is that you want to do with other people that you work with who happen to be in
Yeah.
your geographical area. they'll just help you do that. And so there's a lot more autonomy and support for that
Mm.
kind of interaction.
That's really neat, and it gets me excited about what's possible there. And it also makes me think, certainly in the advertising space, there's so much of that talent in house already who know how to like design and create experiences that
Mm-hmm.
I would love to see some people in my world like lean into that to develop a more interesting, flexible work arrangement and rethink their spaces and all that kind of stuff. Because I think ultimately kind of coming back to this goal that you and Tamara have worked on around creating and finding meaning at work. If you enjoy the way your work has been designed, it feels like you've set the table to then be able to create and find meaning. And I know we want to wrap up here in a few, so I just want to get to the last few questions. One question I'll ask really quick for you, which is, what's the most meaningful work you've done in your career so far?
That's a great question. I would say probably the work that I'm doing now, because I'm
Awesome.
really connecting with leaders. I'm getting to support them on their journey, provide them with resources, and actually watch them improve and grow and turn into successful business owners or CEOs or even new managers.
Yeah.
So to me, that's really rewarding, seeing that impact. And I got into this business because it has, in my mind, a scaled impact when I'm able to do that with someone who runs a company, and then they're able to pass that along to the people in their organization.
Yeah.
Not only does that make the organization better, the business better, but it makes everyone's lives better too. So it's my way of giving back to the world.
Yeah, that's really cool. I can feel that as you talk about it. It's a really cool thing to just see how you're kind of lighting up. Speaking of lighting up, if you could kind of wave a magic wand and desuckify work for more folks, it sounds like you're kind of doing it. But is there anything else that you think we could do to really make work better for everybody?
Well, I know you talked a little bit with Tamara when she was on about the 3 sources of meaning at work, which are community, contribution, and challenge.
Yeah.
And community is the sense that we matter in our organization, that we belong. Contribution is the belief that the work that we're doing matters to others, that it's laddering up to like some greater purpose or having a positive impact on people. And challenge is that opportunity that you know, for learning and growing and reaching your own full potential. And all 3 of those things I think are important, and they sound really lofty, but I think there are easy ways that leaders can start to tap into those. And I think just thinking about, you know, for community, are you asking what's happening in people's lives outside of work? Do you ever just take the time to say, hey, what's going on in your life right now?
Yeah.
It's easy to do. It takes a short amount of time. And what it says is that I'm actually interested in you as a person, not in just the deliverables that you hand to me today. For contribution, we often think about that as, oh, I have to be making the world a better place, or I have to be changing something really significant. And that helps for sure. But just being appreciated for your work as a leader, just telling someone, thank you for that, is incredibly powerful, and also something that's very underutilized. So just remembering to say thank you. There was a Gallup study that came out recently that showed that thanking one thank you from a manager once a week was enough to cut burnout and disengagement in half.
Wow.
Yeah. So
I'm not surprised, only because I remember like one of the first times a manager said thank you, and I was so taken aback by it. I was like beaming. I'm like, you're thanking me. This is awesome. It was really cool. So I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's easy. It's very
it is.
easy. And I think for the third one, which is challenge, which is about as a leader supporting people in their growth and development. Just saying, I think you can do this. How can I help?
Yeah. Yeah. So simple. Yeah. There's like faith in that statement that I really like. I know we want to run if you're open. I know I mentioned we do a little sound effect thing on this show. Are you open to giving us a quick sound effect for the?
I'm really curious what other people's sound effects have been. What are we talking about here?
Oh God. I mean, some people have joined the cat train that I started. Some people have done things as simple as like the sound of applause or something like kind of a thing. Like it's been a pretty like wide variety, but it can be super simple, like the sound of a drum beat or something. I mean, like whatever shows up.
I actually like the sound I notice most when people are actually interested and engaged in what's going on is
Yeah, I like that too. Yeah, I find that I notice myself doing that occasionally where I'm like, yeah. And it's so instinctive that it's real.
Yeah, it's authentic. It's not like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, I really love that for you.
Exactly. Well, last quick question is just how do people find you, Wes, and learn more about the cool stuff you're doing?
Absolutely. I'm on LinkedIn, Wes Adams, and my website is svcg.co. You can find me there, and obviously keep an eye out for the book that Tamara and I will be launching early next year.
Oh, I'm really excited for that. I mean, you both bring so much, just so much hope for what's possible in work with the work that you guys do. So I'm excited about that. And thank you, Wes, for coming on the show and sharing some really interesting perspectives on how we can make work more meaningful and more interesting for people.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Wes. Bye-bye.
All right. Thanks, TJ.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to the Desuckify Work Podcast. And thanks to Wes for bringing sharp insight and an inspiring vision to the show. You can follow Wes on LinkedIn and check out his site at svcg.co for more details on the amazing work he's doing. It would also be amazing if you checked out my site and my Substack newsletter. And if you could like and subscribe to this podcast, that would be stupendous. Want to bring some desuckification to your workplace? Let's set up a half-hour discovery call. My treat. Bye, everyone.